On October 23, 2077, the world ended in 2 hours. And while we have been exploring vaults and their twisted experiments, 50 states got nuked, irradiated, and left to rot. So with that cheerful note out of the way, let's see what happened to every state in Fallout. Alaska, the first war. Let's start with the state that literally caused the apocalypse. Yeah, you heard that right. Alaska didn't just get nuked on October 23rd, it spent 11 years as an active war zone before that. In 2066, China invaded across the Bering Strait because they were desperate for oil. The Battle of Anchorage was absolutely insane. Imagine trench warfare, but it's negative 40 degrees, and both sides are fighting over frozen oil fields that probably weren't even worth it anymore. General Jingwei and his Chinese forces carved through American defenses for years. The US got pushed back so hard they had to invent power armor just to have a fighting chance. Think about that for a second. America was losing so badly in Alaska that they had to revolutionize military technology just to break even. The T-51 power armor wasn't developed because someone had a cool idea. It was developed because without it, China was going to control all of North America's remaining oil reserves. By January 2077, just 9 months before the bombs fell, Anchorage was finally liberated. The propaganda posters went up. America celebrated. Great job, everyone. Really worth it. Because when the Great War hit in October, Alaska took nuclear strikes from both Chinese and American missiles. The irony is almost poetic. The state that started the resource war ended up so irradiated that whatever oil was left became completely inaccessible. But wait, it gets worse. Right after the bombs, temperatures dropped even harder as nuclear winter hit. The already frozen wasteland became a radioactive ice sheet where survival wasn't just unlikely, it was basically impossible. Anyone trying to set up camp in the ruins wasn't just fighting radiation and mutated wildlife. The cold could kill you in minutes. By 2188, over a century later, massive hordes of feral ghouls poured out of the Anchorage wasteland heading south. Locals called it the Anchorage Scourge, which is a pretty metal name for a zombie apocalypse within the apocalypse. These weren't just regular feral ghouls either. These were ghouls that had survived in one of the most hostile environments on Earth for over a century. Alaska didn't just die in the war, it became a contaminated graveyard that kept killing for generations. The state that America fought so hard to keep became the state that everyone else fought hard to avoid. And the oil? Still there, still frozen, still radioactive, still completely worthless. Alaska fought an 11-year war and became a frozen graveyard nobody remembers. But one state didn't just survive. It actually rebuilt civilization, and that success might have been even more tragic. California, the Republic. California is the only state that didn't just survive, it actually tried to rebuild America. And honestly, that ambition might have been its biggest mistake. Look, California got absolutely hammered during the Great War. Los Angeles took multiple direct hits, creating the Boneyard. San Francisco got hit so hard that parts of the city sank into the bay. San Diego's naval base was a priority target that got vaporized. The state's major population centers were devastated. But here's the difference. California had vaults that actually worked as intended, or at least close enough. Vault 15 gave birth to Shady Sands in 2142. Vault 8 became Vault City. Vault 13 produced the Vault Dweller who saved the region from the Master's super mutant army. These weren't just settlements scraping by on irradiated squirrel meat. They were the seeds of actual civilization. By 2189, the new California Republic was born from Shady Sands. Democracy, rule of law, actual infrastructure. It was basically the only place in post-war America that remembered what the government was supposed to look like. Not raiders with delusions of grandeur, not tech-hoarding isolationists, but actual representative democracy. The NCR expanded rapidly, north into Oregon, east toward Nevada, south into Baja. By 2281, the NCR controlled more territory than any other faction in North America, over 700,000 people. That's actual civilization numbers. They had an army, a currency backed by gold, trade routes, agriculture, and industry. They had corruption and bureaucracy, which weirdly enough was kind of reassuring because it meant they'd rebuilt enough of pre-war America to include all the annoying parts too. So naturally, they screwed it up. Success breeds problems, and the NCR had all of them. They spread themselves way too thin fighting wars on multiple fronts. The Brotherhood War drained massive resources. The Mojave Campaign turned into a meat grinder at Hoover Dam against Caesar's Legion, a faction that treated slavery and crucifixion as legitimate government policy. Internally, the NCR struggled with overextension. Supply lines stretched too far. Communication broke down. Brahmin barons wielded disproportionate political power. Corruption crept into every level of bureaucracy. The NCR was becoming the pre-war America it was trying to rebuild, complete with all the problems that led to the Great War in the first place. And then there's Shady Sands. According to one timeline, the capital got destroyed sometime after 2277. The fall of Shady Sands, whether it was sabotage, war, or internal collapse, we don't have all the details, but the symbolism is brutal. The city that started the NCR NCR that proved civilization could return was potentially destroyed while the Republic was busy fighting external wars. The NCR is proof that even when you do everything right, the wasteland finds a way to kick you in the teeth. California tried to save America, and America rewarded them by potentially blowing up their capital and exposing every flaw in their system. Yeah, that plan worked out really well for them. Democracy and expansion couldn't save California, but what about one genius with perfect planning and a pre-war defense grid? Turns out Nevada had both, and it still wasn't enough. Nevada, perfect planning Vegas, barely got hit, not through luck, but through the most elaborate defense system one man ever built. Mr. House, the pre-war genius who founded Robco Industries, saw the Great War coming years in advance. He spent enormous resources developing a laser defense grid around Las Vegas. When October 23rd came and Chinese missiles streaked across the sky, House's system activated. It worked, mostly. The defense grid shot down most of the warheads aimed at Vegas. The Strip itself survived mostly intact, a glittering oasis in a radioactive desert frozen in time like a pre-war museum that still had power. The catch? The system's activation fried parts of House's cryogenic life support. He fell into a coma that lasted longer than intended. House planned to wake up after a few years. Instead, he woke up in 2138, 60 years after the bombs fell. It wasn't until 2274 that he finally revealed himself, deploying his Securitron army to reclaim the Strip. All that planning, all that preparation, and he still ended up in the middle of someone else's war. But House is nothing if not adaptable. He reactivated the Securitron army. He rebuilt the three families from local tribals to run his casinos. He played the NCR and Legion against each other while maintaining Vegas's independence. The man spent 2 centuries in a coma and still managed to run circles around every other faction in the Mojave. The rest of Nevada wasn't so fortunate. Vault 22's spore carriers turned parts of Nevada into biological hazard zones where plants eat you instead of the other way around. The fungus puppeted corpses to spread more spores, walking mushroom zombies, because regular zombies weren't horrifying enough. Vault 11 tells maybe the darkest story in the entire Fallout franchise. Residents were told they had to sacrifice one person yearly, or the Vault's life support would kill everyone. So they held elections where the winner got executed. For years, they built an entire political system around ritual murder. By the time only 5 residents remained, they'd had enough. They marched into the sacrifice chamber together and told the AI they were done. And then the AI congratulated them. The Vault was never going to kill them. It was a test to see if they'd refuse to murder each other. They'd passed. After decades of unnecessary death, they'd passed a test they didn't know was a test. 4 of the 5 survivors immediately shot themselves. One walked out into the Mojave and was never seen again. Vault 11 is proof that sometimes the cruelest experiments test whether humans will kill each other for no reason. And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. Vault 34 was stuffed with weapons instead of living space. The residents eventually revolted, the reactor got sabotaged, and radiation flooded the vault. Survivors became the Boomers, a heavily armed faction that shoots first and never bothers with questions. Nevada survived the initial blast better than almost anywhere in America, but between fungal zombies, political horror experiments, and reactor meltdowns, the aftermath tried its hardest to finish what the bombs started. And honestly, between House's autocracy, NCR's imperialism, and Caesar's slavery, I'm not sure any of the possible futures for Nevada were actually good. But if House proves that planning ahead doesn't guarantee survival, Massachusetts proves that being the smartest people in the room doesn't either. Massachusetts. Genius horror, Boston took a direct hit on October 23, 2077. The bomb created the glowing sea, a perpetually irradiated hellscape where radiation levels stayed lethal 2 centuries later. Even in full power armor with rad protection, the glowing sea tries to kill you. But the real story of Massachusetts isn't the bomb that destroyed the surface. It's what happened underground at MIT. The Institute, formerly MIT, saw the war coming. They built a massive underground facility beneath the campus, a self-contained research city isolated from the surface. When the bombs fell, they sealed themselves in and kept working. For 2 centuries, the Institute advanced technology in complete isolation. By 2287, they had synths, synthetic humans indistinguishable from real people. They had teleportation technology, they had molecular relays, advanced robotics. The Institute was, objectively, the most technologically advanced faction in post-war America. Pretty impressive, right? Wrong, because the Institute had a fundamental problem. They looked at the surface not as a community of survivors trying to rebuild, but as a laboratory full of test subjects. The Institute kidnapped people from surface settlements and replaced them with synth duplicates, sometimes for espionage, sometimes for experimentation, sometimes just to see if they could. They released super mutants to observe how settlements would respond. They sabotaged attempts at organized government because they viewed surface dwellers as too primitive. In 2229, the Commonwealth Provisional Government formed. For the first time since the bombs fell, Massachusetts was trying to unify under democratic rule. The Institute's response? The Institute Massacre. They killed the representatives, destroyed the attempt at government, and ensured the Commonwealth would remain fragmented. The Institute had all the technology needed to rebuild civilization, and chose instead to treat the wasteland like their personal petri dish. When your greatest achievement is creating synthetic humans, and your first instinct is to use them as infiltrators while murdering anyone trying to form legitimate government, maybe reconsider your entire philosophy. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth fractured into isolated settlements. Diamond City became the largest settlement, but even it struggled with synth paranoia. Goodneighbor became a haven for drifters and criminals. Countless small settlements barely survived between super mutant attacks, raider raids, and the ever-present fear that your neighbor might be a synth. For decades, the Institute kidnapped surface dwellers and subjected them to FEV exposure, creating super mutants that were then released back to the surface. Imagine getting kidnapped by underground scientists, transformed into a monster, and dumped back in the wasteland with no memory of who you were. By 2287, Massachusetts was a four-way Cold War between the Institute underground, the Brotherhood of Steel arriving in their giant airship, the railroad protecting synth refugees, and the Minutemen held together by one persuasive general. The fate of the entire Commonwealth hinged on which faction won, and honestly, none of the outcomes looked particularly great for anyone who just wanted to farm tomatoes in peace. Massachusetts proves that intelligence and technology mean nothing without wisdom and empathy. The Institute had the tools to save the Commonwealth, and chose, instead, to treat it like an experiment. They were the smartest people in the room, and the cruelest, which is its own special kind of tragedy. Massachusetts had underground scientists treating the surface like a laboratory, but at least they had factions trying to rebuild something. The Capital Wasteland didn't even get that mercy, and 200 years later, it still hasn't recovered. Capital Wasteland, America's graveyard. The Capital Wasteland, covering Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., is hands down the worst place in post-war America. Everywhere got nuked. Everywhere suffered. But the Capital Wasteland got special attention because the Chinese wanted to decapitate American leadership. Washington, D.C. took multiple direct strikes from high-yield warheads. The White House, the Capitol building, the Pentagon, all priority targets that got hit with everything China had. China threw everything at D.C. because if you're starting World War III, you kill the leadership first. Maryland and Virginia caught all the fallout and overflow strikes. Baltimore's ports got hit. Naval Station Norfolk got vaporized. The surrounding areas took enough radiation that 200 years later, the groundwater is still toxic enough to cause mutations. Here's the crazy part. 200 years after the bombs fell, the Capital Wasteland was still a radioactive hellhole. Everywhere else, at least, tried to recover. California built the NCR. Vegas got rebuilt by house. Even the Midwest established trade routes. The Capital Wasteland said no thanks and stayed absolutely miserable. Super mutants from Vault 87 hunted humans throughout the region. These weren't intelligent super mutants. These were rushed FEV experiments gone wrong, mentally damaged and pissed off. They captured humans for conversion or food. Downtown DC became super mutant territory where humans only went if they were suicidal or Brotherhood of Steel. Raiders controlled the ruins like packs of feral dogs. Talon Company, regulators, and countless other mercenary groups turned the wasteland into a war zone where trust was a death sentence. And then the Enclave emerged from Raven Rock, bringing with them the worst of pre-war America's ideology. The Enclave decided that everyone exposed to radiation was genetically impure and needed to be exterminated. Their solution? Modified FEV in the water supply that would kill anyone with radiation-induced mutations, which was basically everyone. Genocide through plumbing. Efficient, horrifying, and perfectly on-brand for the Enclave. The only thing keeping the region from total collapse was the Brotherhood of Steel. Elder Lyons broke from the main Brotherhood's doctrine to actually help wastelanders instead of just hoarding technology. The Brotherhood fought super mutants in DC. They protected trade caravans. They worked on Project Purity to clean the Potomac River. Project Purity represents everything beautiful and tragic about the Capital Wasteland. Dr. James and his team worked for decades on a system to purify the Potomac's irradiated water. Not for profit, not for power, just to give people clean water. When the project finally neared completion, it became a war zone. The Enclave tried to weaponize it. The Brotherhood fought to protect it. James sacrificed himself to keep it from Enclave control. The Capital Wasteland proves that sometimes the apocalypse picks a favorite target and never lets go. 200 years of continuous suffering, mutation, and violence. The Capital Wasteland stayed broken because it got hit too hard and had too much symbolic value to ignore. Everyone wanted to control DC, but nobody wanted to actually fix it. The Capital Wasteland stayed broken because everyone wanted to control it, but nobody wanted to fix it. Pennsylvania had the opposite problem. Everyone knew about the Pitt steel mills, but nobody wanted to talk about the cost of keeping them running. Pennsylvania, the Pitt Pittsburgh, or the Pit, as it's known post-war, represents everything wrong with industrial America amplified to nightmare levels. The city took nuclear hits during the Great War, but what really defined the Pit was something that kept burning long after the bombs. The steel mills, never went out. When nuclear fire rained down on Pittsburgh's industrial heart, the mills were running at full capacity for the war effort. 200 years later, those mills are still burning, still pumping toxic smoke into the air, still irradiating everything in the region. The air in the pit is thick with poison. Breathing the air slowly poisons you. Working in the mills accelerates the process dramatically, and yet people still work there because the pit has something almost nowhere else in post-war America has: industrial production capacity. By 2277, the pit had become a slave city under the control of Asher, a former Brotherhood paladin. Asher survived a Brotherhood expedition, took control of local raider gangs, and built an empire on one principle: the pit's mills could manufacture steel, and steel meant weapons, and weapons meant power. But running pre-war mills in a radioactive hellhole requires workers, lots of workers. Workers who would inevitably get poisoned by the radiation. Asher's solution was slavery. Raiders captured wastelanders and brought them to the pit, where they were forced to work in the mills until the radiation transformed them into trogs. Trogs are what happens when human exposure to the pit's unique cocktail of radiation and toxins reaches critical mass. You don't just become a ghoul, you become something worse. Your body mutates, your mind degrades, and you become a feral, cannibalistic thing. The workers know this is their fate. They work knowing that every day brings them closer to becoming monsters, and they can't escape. Here's the part that makes the pit genuinely disturbing. Asher wasn't entirely wrong in his reasoning. The pit's industrial capacity made it one of the few places in post-war America that could manufacture steel, ammunition, and weapons at pre-war quality. Every faction with ambitions of rebuilding needed what the pit could produce. But production required workers, and workers required slavery. Nobody volunteers to die slowly. Asher argued that a few decades of slavery was justified if it meant restoring industrial civilization. It's the trolley problem written across an entire city. Free the slaves and lose the only functional steel mill, potentially dooming hope of rebuilding. Keep the slaves and condemn thousands to transformation into monsters. Pitt doesn't ask if you're willing to make hard choices. It asks if you're willing to make choices where hard is a euphemism for horrific. The pit is what happens when the apocalypse strips away any possibility of moral high ground. Every choice is terrible. Every outcome involves massive suffering. You can't fix the pit without getting blood on your hands. The rest of Pennsylvania took confirmed nuclear strikes throughout the state. Philadelphia was almost certainly hit. Harrisburg, the state capital, was a strategic target. The eastern part of the state got carpeted with enough nuclear strikes that the whole region became a contaminated dead zone. Pennsylvania didn't survive the Great War. It just burned at different temperatures. The pit burns hot and makes you work until you transform into a monster. The rest of Pennsylvania burned fast and left nothing but ghosts. Pitt proves that sometimes survival requires choices so horrific that you question whether survival is worth it. And if Pennsylvania shows what happens when morality becomes negotiable, the Midwest shows what happens when technology becomes religion. Midwest, Brotherhood territory. The Midwest Commonwealth covered Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. When the bombs fell, the Midwest suffered like everywhere else. Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, all took direct nuclear strikes. Industrial centers became craters. The Great Lakes became breeding grounds for mutations. But the Midwest had something other regions didn't: the Midwest Brotherhood of Steel. This was a Brotherhood expeditionary force that went rogue during a cross-country mission, establishing their own chapter with their own rules. The Midwest Brotherhood was different from the start. The West Coast Brotherhood hoarded tech like it was holy. The Capital Wasteland Brotherhood tried to help people but struggled with resources. The Midwest Brotherhood took a third path: aggressive expansion and pragmatic recruitment. They recruited tribals. They accepted ghouls and even super mutants. They used vehicles, aircraft, and technological advantages to carve out an empire across the Midwest. Chicago became their center of power. They weren't hiding from the wasteland. They were conquering it. But conquest requires constant expansion, and expansion requires resources. The Midwest Brotherhood's territory grew, but so did their needs. They demanded tribute from anyone under their protection. They forcibly conscripted new recruits. They seized technology from anyone who had it. The Brotherhood, that started as protectors, slowly became warlords extracting resources from the weak. St. Louis became a super mutant stronghold that the Brotherhood fought for years to contain. Detroit's automotive factories attracted scavengers and death in equal measure. The ruins held working manufacturing equipment, but radiation levels made salvage operations incredibly dangerous. The factories became haunted places where the promise of treasure lured people to their deaths. Minnesota and Wisconsin dealt with the added challenge of nuclear winter. The Midwest already had harsh winters before the war. After the bombs, temperatures dropped and stayed low for decades. Starvation, freezing, and desperate violence killed more people in the first few years than the bombs did. Kansas deserves special mention. The city of Gravestone worshipped an unexploded nuclear bomb. The crater worshippers believed the bomb was a god waiting to ascend them through nuclear fire. Empire. They protected it, prayed to it, and violently attacked anyone who tried to defuse it, because when the apocalypse happens, some people respond by worshipping the thing that nearly killed them. Radioactive tornadoes became a regular weather phenomenon across the Plains states. These were actual tornadoes that picked up radioactive dust, creating mobile contamination zones that killed anything they touched. The Midwest didn't die quickly. It died screaming, slowly, while hoarding the technology that could have helped. The Brotherhood had the tools to rebuild. They chose conquest instead. 200 years later, the Midwest is a Brotherhood empire where technology flows up and protection trickles down. It's feudalism with laser rifles. The Midwest became a Brotherhood empire where technology meant power and power meant control. At least they documented what happened. The South died so thoroughly that even its death went mostly unrecorded, which might be the cruelest fate of all. The South, the vanishing Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and Florida made up the Gulf Commonwealth and the broader South. This region is the least documented area in all of Fallout lore, and that silence is more terrifying than any detailed horror story because it means almost nobody survived to document what happened. When the Brotherhood doesn't bother documenting a place, when trade routes avoid it completely, when maps just leave it blank, that tells you everything about how thoroughly a place died. The South didn't just get nuked, it vanished from history. What little we know is scattered and terrifying. The Beastmasters, a tribal faction, somehow tamed wasteland creatures across the Gulf region. Think about what that means. In a world with deathclaws that can shred power armor, with red scorpions the size of cars, someone figured out how to domesticate them. That's either brilliant or suicidally insane. Taming a deathclaw requires getting close to something that can kill you in seconds. The Beastmasters achieved it, creating a faction that controlled territories through sheer intimidation. Imagine raiders approaching a settlement ready to loot, only to find the settlers riding deathclaws. The conversation ends quickly. Louisiana's swamps became even more hostile after the war. The bayous were already dangerous before the bombs. Post-war, the humidity in swamp water became perfect for breeding mutations. The swamps consumed entire pre-war cities under radioactive muck. New Orleans, Baton Rouge, entire urban centers just disappeared into the wetlands. What emerged from those swamps didn't resemble anything that lived before the war. Stories from traders speak of radiation-mutated alligators large enough to swallow a person whole, swarms of insects that moved with coordinated intelligence, plants that grew fast enough to trap and consume prey. Mississippi and Alabama simply vanished from the record. No major cities are documented. No surviving factions, no trade routes. The region became a blank spot, where even 2 centuries later, nobody knows what happened. Did the bombs kill everyone? Did the population migrate? Did something worse than radiation kill what the bombs didn't? We don't know. The silence is absolute. Texas presented a special problem due to its sheer size and strategic importance. Houston's ports and oil refineries undoubtedly took multiple nuclear strikes. Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, all would have been targeted. But Texas is massive. Rural areas between the cities might have survived the immediate strikes. The question is, what happened to those survivors? Texas had a strong independent culture before the war. Post-war, that independence might have helped communities survive, or it might have prevented cooperation, leading to isolated communities dying alone. We don't know because nobody survived to document it. Florida became so irrelevant that Brotherhood records list it as literal fiction. I don't even know what that means. Did Florida get so thoroughly destroyed that records of its existence seem fake? Did everyone die and the region become so contaminated that even the Brotherhood refuses to acknowledge it? The fact that we don't know is somehow worse than any specific answer. The South represents something uniquely terrifying in the Fallout universe: complete absence. Other regions failed, and we know how. The South just vanished. 200 years of history erased. Millions of people gone without record. Whatever happened to the South was so complete that even the stories died. But not every region vanished into silence. Some adapted so well to the apocalypse that they barely noticed the difference, which is its own kind of horror. New York, Silent Tomb. New York City was the largest city in pre-war America, home to millions, the financial capital of the world. When the Great War came, China hit New York with everything they had. Manhattan took multiple direct strikes. The financial district, Times Square, the UN headquarters, all vaporized in the first minutes. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, all hit hard enough that survivors were rare and lucky. The city that never slept went silent in less than an hour. The subways became tombs. Millions took shelter underground when the air raid sirens sounded. They weren't safe. When the bombs hit, the tunnels became ovens, then coffins. Blast waves traveled through the tunnels, killing thousands instantly. Radiation seeped through ventilation shafts. Fires consumed oxygen. People who survived the initial initial strikes died slowly in the dark, waiting for rescue that never came. 200 years later, New York remains mostly undocumented. No major factions control it. No trade routes pass through it. The ruins are too dangerous, too irradiated, too structurally unstable. Buildings that survived the blast became death traps as centuries of decay made them liable to collapse. What little information exists comes from rare scavengers who entered and made it back out. They speak of feral ghouls in numbers that make DC look underpopulated. Entire city blocks claimed by ghoul colonies, super mutants occupying fortified positions, raiders fighting over territory barely worth controlling, and underneath it all, the subways, still filled with the dead, still radioactive, still silent. New York was too big, too populated, too important to ignore. China made sure it died, and died completely. The city that represented American achievement became the city that proved American vulnerability. Upstate New York fared slightly better. Rural communities managed to survive through isolation and agriculture, but without connection to the coast or other regions, they remained isolated settlements barely scraping by. New York proves that sometimes the biggest targets die the hardest and stay dead the longest. The city is a monument to what America lost, and nobody wants to visit monuments built from millions of corpses. West Virginia, Reclamation Day. West Virginia occupies a unique place in Fallout history as the only state where we know exactly what happened in the first decades after the bombs because Vault 76 was designed to document it. Vault 76 was a control vault, no experiments, built to celebrate America's tricentennial. It was supposed to open after 20 years, releasing residents to rebuild on Reclamation Day, 2102. And it did. The vault opened exactly on schedule. Residents emerged with optimism, training, and resources. They found hell. West Virginia had taken strategic nuclear strikes across the state. Charleston, Morgantown, Harper's Ferry, all targets. But the real problem wasn't the bombs. It was what came after. The scorched plague swept across Appalachia, transforming humans into crystalline zombies that spread infection through violence. The scorched weren't just mindless. They coordinated, used weapons, hunted systematically, and they were contagious. The Free States, a survivalist faction that had prepared for nuclear war, survived the initial strikes in bunkers. They emerged to fight the scorched and lost. Their paranoia and preparation meant nothing against a plague that turned your neighbors into weapons against you. By 2102, when Vault 76 opened, the Free States were extinct. The responders, pre-war emergency services personnel, tried maintaining order. They set up medical facilities, distributed supplies, and trained survivors. They documented everything. The scorched killed them all. Their last messages are desperate pleas for help that never came. The Brotherhood of Steel's Appalachian chapter tried to contain the scorched threat. They identified the source, scorch beasts, massive mutated bats emerging from fissures in the earth. The Brotherhood launched strikes to seal them. The scorched overwhelmed them. By 2102, the Appalachian Brotherhood was gone. Vault 76 residents emerged into a region where every major faction had tried to save Appalachia, and died trying. The optimism of Reclamation Day met the reality of a dead region where the plague was still active, still spreading, still killing. The Vault dwellers had to succeed where everyone else failed. West Virginia is proof that even when you do everything right, prepare for every contingency, document everything, the wasteland can still kill you. The state became a testing ground for post-war survival, and every test subject before Vault 76 failed. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happened to every Fallout vault, click on the video on the screen.